very much for coming. We're moving across to South Asia now in our research conversations. Without any further ado, I'll turn this over to Lama and to Richard. They're both early career Leverhulme Fellows in the faculty, and Lama's at Wolfson and Richard's at Trinity, but they are faculty Leverhulme people. And thank you for all coming. If there's food you can munch, I think we've designed this as a brown bag for the lunch Sunday, but nobody ever eats this except David Taylor.
I always eat.
So thank you very much. Please.
Okay, shall I start? Thank you very much for turning up, everyone, and thank you very much for organizing this. I've been asked to talk about what I'm doing at the moment here and what my research focus is. It is I've just started my Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship, and it is on Tibetan literature as a confluence of the oral and the literary. And I'm looking at the sort of Tibetan literary production with a focus upon the sort of interplay between, say, oral poetry and the huge Tibetan literary corpus. Tibet, I'm sure many of you know, has a long literary history, and the written records of this history could be traced back to around 7th century. It is characterized by a creative interplay between the spoken and the written word. Yet, to the present day, this interface remains largely overlooked in the scholarship on Tibetan literature. So my research so far has been an attempt to explore these oral and textual roots of contemporary Tibetan literature, entailing both poetry and fiction. And I have been examining its continuing dynamic sort of interaction with the living traditions of Tibetan oral poetry. And in the process, I have come to learn that there is a serious need to investigate this issue further by casting the net over a wider swathe of Tibetan literature. And that's why I would like to find out the fertile and complex interaction of plain speech and the written works in a variety of literary creations, and predating so-called modern Tibetan literature. So, as a Leverhulme Early Fellow, I will continue, of course, to appreciate contemporary Tibetan literature. However, I'll also widen the scope of my research by looking at works that well predate contemporary writing, but that also has serious links and influences on what is happening, the literary productions that are taking place today. And I will be focusing on three literary forms, namely gur, poem songs, sometimes translated as, and Indian sort of derived kavya poetry, and the essay, and the Tibetan essay, the literary essay. And these three categories seem particularly relevant to the topic of the oral and written literature, yet have never really been investigated from this perspective. And many scholars of Tibetan literature highlight the presence of ordinary speech in contemporary Tibetan literature, especially contemporary Tibetan literary works, but tend to attribute this element to the arrival of the Chinese Communist Party in Tibet in the early 1950s, and the language reforms that carried out by the Chinese Communist Party, which has the explicit purpose of promoting communist ideology and consolidating political rule in Tibet. But these reforms also, sort of in the name of vernacular simplification, these reforms targeted Tibetan case system in terms of grammar and spelling and punctuation. So of course it had had an impact. But however, this is an inadequate explanation on its own because it fails to take into consideration traditional forms of Tibetan literature with the salient vernacularizing features. So an examination of the just mentioned three forms will reveal that these vernacularizing characteristics are not a novel phenomenon of contemporary Tibetan literary production under colonial rule. However, but it is an unexplored feature of Tibet's long literary tradition. In fact, I believe that Tibetan literature, both classical and modern, cannot be understood fully without an appreciation of its vernacular dimensions. So my research seeks to tackle this oversight by embracing a long view. And firstly, I would like to examine the enduring category of ngur, what is sometimes, as I said, awkwardly translated as poem songs or song poems. I mean, it is one of the oldest and most accessible modes of Tibetan artistic creation. Throughout the ages, Tibetan warrior kings, ascetic yogis, scholar lamas, and lay people have employed this poetic form to express themselves and portray their socio-historical milieu. It is noteworthy not because of its focus on spiritual experience and philosophical reflections, but because of its literary merit. And also it contains biographical detail and diverse records of Tibetan social history. So while appreciating its enduring artistic legacy, I'll also study all these aspects which show it is an invaluable medium of capturing Tibetan social and cultural change. So song poem or ngur is characterized by a unique style, simplicity of language, communicative efficacy, aesthetic appeal, personal tone, and colloquial familiarity. It also bears sort of poetic potential, and as such we can see its inspirational energy still coursing through the poetic compositions of today's Tibet. So due to its age and popularity, it forms a vast body of literature. So being mindful of this complexity and diversity, my research will be paying specific attention to the works of some neglected great masters from 12th century onwards. And their poems and songs blend the literary and everyday language. And they are brilliant ancestor poets who continue to inspire contemporary Tibetan writers, not to mention their, of course, lasting spiritual legacy that informs Tibetan Buddhism, goes on informing Tibetan Buddhism, Buddhist practice and thinking today. And next, secondly, I'll be focusing on, hopefully I'm all right with the time, I'll focus on Tibetan Kavya poetry, which adopts an ornate style informed by strict technical and aesthetic principles derived from the Indian literary tradition. The influence of Kavya poetics on Tibetan intellectuals can be traced back to the 8th century, around 8th century. But it has really dominated Tibetan literary production since the 13th century, when it started to flourish in earnest and took deep roots. However, contrary to conventional belief, Kavya neither totally marginalized indigenous forms of Tibetan composition, nor jettisoned the vernacular idiom of Tibetan oral poetry. This is despite the fact that Kavya poetics expanded in works like Dandin's Kavya Darsa the mirror of poetics, categorically advises poets or wannabe poets to avoid the use of colloquial expressions. So once again, whilst being conscious of the expansive and widely varied Tibetan Kavya literature, I'll concentrate on much overlooked poetic works of great past Tibetan masters who fuse literary language with the oral poetry again. And this inquiry will also shed light upon the origins and development of a modern poetic category known as the new verse in contemporary Tibetan literary production. And this genre consciously mixes conventional forms of verse and vernacularism, and it is an effective and a popular vehicle for capturing and expressing the current conditions of Tibet. And thirdly, my research will examine the Tibetan essay, another prominent literary phenomenon that bears sort of heavy oral imprints. The essay suffers from scholarly neglect, although it has been indispensable for Tibetan intellectual development, and it has been a site of artistic creativity since at least, I would say, the early 20th century. Well, like the essay forms from other nations, flexibility, critical age, open-endedness, freedom, sort of concision, and subjective consciousness characterize Tibetan essay. And the aspects in terms of form and choice of subject matter have made the essay an effective and popular vehicle for intellectual discourse and communication in contemporary Tibet. I'll trace the origin of Tibetan literary essay back to traditional Tibetan writers and pre-modern Tibetan writers, especially those great writers who were alive in the 19th century, early 19th century. And this will help to undermine the impact of the Tibetan oral tradition with regard to essayists' use of language, rhetorical devices, and figurative speech. So, Gur and Kavya poetry and the Tibetan essay are clearly distinct literary forms, but they all share common textual features and oral roots. My emphasis upon this blend of orality and the written undermines the theoretical assertions of a great divide between oral and literary traditions. It underscores the need for a more flexible theoretical approach that draws upon, amongst other things, comparative cultural and literary studies. In conclusion, I would like to, I believe that the richness and diversity of Tibetan literary creations are the product of the convergence of the oral and the written word. It is this convergence that I seek to explore, assisted by a Liverhume Fellowship, and of course the stimulating environment provided by the Oriental Institute and Oxford University, and all of you here.
Well
Thank
said.
you.
So to kick off the sort of conversational part of it, I thought I should just point out that I share an office with Lama, and we sit next door to each other, and I had no idea what he worked on at all until this. And I assumed he was working on modern Tibetan literature, and I thought, well, I don't know anything about Tibet, and I do sort of early modern and colonial North Indian literature, so, it's nice that we're in the same space, but really, what do we have in common? And then I read through what he's presented, and I realised we actually have so much in common, and a lot of shared questions. So I'm going to be quite selfish and just bombard you with issues that I'm grappling with in terms of vernacular literature in North India, and I want to just see what your perspective is from the other side of the Himalayas. So I mean, to start off with vernacular language, throughout your project, there's this whole interesting question about how can we think through the relationship between literary speech and everyday speech. And obviously with my work, this is very difficult because, you have some forms of vernacular which are also related to Kavya, for example, and are incredibly ornate. And so often the Sanskritists will say, oh, well, this is, very close to the language of the people, the language of the land. Whereas when you look at it, in fact, it's so ornate and refined, no one was ever going to be speaking this. So then actually trying to retrace what people were speaking, what the everyday street level language is actually very difficult, because you can start saying, well, maybe prose where everything rhymes and has prosody as verse where everything rhymes, etc., is a problem. So then let's look at other genres. And I noticed that you are drawing in so many different genres into play, from essays and prose to Kavya. So what are your thoughts on, actually, is it possible to reconstruct a sort of everyday language from these texts? Or even if you're looking at something that looks low level, popular oral, actually it is a literary form of speech as well? I mean...
Yes, it's a fascinating question. I mean, it's a question that I myself grappling with. Yes, it's really hard, and I don't think I am, and neither maybe you are as well, that trying to reconstruct a vernacular or oral language from the past. I don't think that's what we're trying to do, and I think it's impossible. As this great Tibetan historian Gindin Chimpul said, unless there's somebody who is 1,000 years old, we can't ask such questions to people. So yes, but having said that, in terms of Tibetan literature, especially Tibetan Gur, kind of this song poem literature, where these song poems are scattered in the great biographies and autobiographies of Tibetan masters or yogis, sort of wandering yogis. And you will find especially Ulrika, what Ulrika is focusing on, or one of Ulrika's research interests, is the Gadamba sort of literature, which is maybe 11th century, 12th century onwards. Gadamba himself, the founding sort of school of Tibetan Buddhism, the founding father is a nomad, like myself. But you will see in his these scriptures, you will see a very sort of oral-based narrative and oral-based compositions going on. So one could almost see that it is sort of these are oral forms in the written word. So I think we could trace quite a lot of vernacular language through these literary texts. However, having said that, then the impact, because Tibet is such a sort of literary conscious nation, I would say, a civilization, although most of people are illiterate, the language and their consciousness and their Buddhist and Bon consciousness has been infiltrated by the literary word. Then it's very hard. So someone like my own mother, who couldn't read a letter of Tibetan alphabet, could recite serious verses that are derived from Indian literature, through Kavya, through Sanskrit or Pali or different Indian languages. And so then it's the question of, is that oral or written? So it's hard. So what I'm trying to say is this sort of a so-called formal literary language has definitely infiltrated the oral speech, the ordinary speech. And so that is a very, very complex, difficult question to tackle. Yes.
And you just mentioned these poem songs, and you said that this is a very sort of awkward translation. But so just thinking a bit more about those, are you factoring in how a musical culture intersects with this, and why are we sort of thinking of them in literary text terms? I mean, obviously, if you look at a lyric on the page, then you want to think of it as a literary text which you can use literary tools for. But how are these songs actually circulating? Are they always circulating in manuscripts and in printed books, or are there professional communities of musicians or singers who also have this repertoire which they know orally? I mean, how is it circulated and transmitted?
I think nowadays it's safe to say that it's being circulated through the written text, written word. But having said that, again, it had been circulated, passed down most orally, say. Usually, I think it's one of the most important elements of this is that it is a mode of, it's a poetic mode, but it's also a very effective vehicle for disseminating Buddhist teaching. So it is always in the biographies of great masters and yogis, we see that it's sung. Those are sung words. Sometimes I call them sung words. And when you read some of these songs, of course the rhythm and the metrical composition of it, there is a certain rhythm going on. But you will also see the cadence of it. You will sort of hear the cadence of it and the musicality of it. And in many cases you will see that it's like almost a song. In some of the cases you will see that some of these sort of poem songs are written in the traditional Tibetan love songs or folk songs that are, the melodies still sort of exist.
Mm. And are these...
Sorry, having said that, that's one thing, but also in terms of the Tibetan epic poetry, the Tibetan epic, the national epic, is passed down by singing. So these are, we're talking about, sometimes it's said that it is the longest poetic epic in the world, and which are obviously full of songs, and it's mostly sung or recited in a sing-song voice.
I just wanted to give others a chance.
Yeah, sorry.
You're sitting next to it.
Yeah, we'll do it in the office. Yeah.
If anyone has anything to offer, to ask, sorry. And if not, I'll go back to Richard. Yes, sorry, Dave.
Lama Jabb, can I push you on this orality issue? So we presume that there was orality, that there were oral poems going on. Mm-hmm. Are you simply equating anything vernacular is evidence that it's an oral source? If not, how beyond the modern period where you can actually hear people producing oral literature, or 19th century travel accounts of recording people producing oral literature, how can you identify sources in the early period that are oral? Unless you're simply equating with vernacular.
Yes. And mostly, obviously, it's textual based now, mostly. I think you have got some recordings in the 40s and maybe even 20s. I think we might have some recordings, and even, maybe 1920s. I think some of the sort of epic, Tibetan epic was sort of episodes were recorded or something. But mostly, yes, it is sort of through the written word. So that complicates things because of the written word. But then having said that, we also have, for instance, we have proverbs preserved in the Donghuang manuscripts, which are maybe from the 8th century, onward, maybe 9th, 8th century. But some of these proverbs are still being used in communities in Tibet. So it begs the question, it makes you ask the question that I always say, for instance, like in any, I think, society, in any nation, we tend to look down upon the oral side of, and the literature and the written work seen as this enlightening instrument, the enlightening vehicle. But when you see this, then you also see that actually orality has a capacity to be able to preserve certain forms of information or modes of communication for a long period of time.
So I think you're still equating vernacular with oral. Now in the Chinese case, vernacular can be different genres, so it's still written, but it's written with a different type of context. Some things you just don't write in classical Chinese quotation marks, and some things you can universally only write in vernacular. So could there be that kind of difference, or could there be a gender aspect with that oral, what you call oral, but I think is really vernacular written, is limited to a certain gender or a certain social group or occupational group?
I think, one finds this in Guru songs a lot, but of course in Tibetan epic literature a lot, or that could be oral or written literature epic. And also, as I mentioned, in Tibetan kavya poems. Kavya poetry really advises what is known as dorkal or palkal and the ordinary language and ordinary parlance. But we see in great Tibetan sort of kavya poets like Gontang Rinpoche and the others, we see that they're really adhering technical sort of guidance of the kavya, and also they're employing kavic sort of formal diction and the set themes and the set formulaic metaphorical phraseology, but at the same time bringing in Tibetan sort of proverbs, or using sometimes talking about the nose ring of a yak, which is very, very Tibetan, I would say. So it can be, the oral imprints can be found in different forms of literature.
But why do you call the proverb oral? Because to me the proverb is the written intrusion of light par excellence.
That's a question of which is first, egg or chicken, maybe.
Well, if the proverb is in a Durgā manuscript, then it's written down. So.
But yes, but something has to be written down. So that was sort of the oral, I would say, oral compositions and oral utterances.
You know, many Western proverbs come from the Bible.
Where did the Bible come from?
Yeah, but
We're not going to decide the egg and chicken question. That's too much. We have to stop and make a quick changeover. So can we say thank you to Lama and Jabb? Okay, we're going to move right along, swapping over. We now have Bihani Sarkar, who is our British Academy postdoc, and our own Professor Diwakar Acharya, who is our Spalding Professor, as we all know. And they're going to talk about something. I'm not going to read out the title because I shamefully can't understand it and can't in fact pronounce it properly anyway, so I will leave it to them to explain what it is. Thank you very much both.
To clarify, it's Heroic Śāktism.
Yes. What I was about to say. Thank you.
Perhaps I can add that I should like to congratulate her. Soon, probably by this summer, we will have her book in our hands. So she is already checking the proofs. In a way, I think everybody knows you are working on Heroic Śāktism since long time, and you are analyzing different aspects of it. Would you somehow first tell us what are the kind of like your findings, conclusions of your research?
Yes, it's a very broad term, but I hope I can get through its various dimensions very quickly in about 15-20 minutes. So my work for the British Academy Postdoctoral Research Fellowship, which I have just finished writing up as a book that I hope will appear on the market in the summer, is about the rise and spread of the cult of a warrior goddess called Durgā between the 3rd and the 12th centuries AD in India. What is fascinating about this warrior goddess is that apart from symbolizing respectable kingship, which she is thought to grant to an ideal warrior, she also has a rather charismatic split personality. One side of her is considered in literature, which is both orally transmitted vernacular poetry, as well as classical oral and written forms. One side is serene and benevolent and gracious and gentle. But ritual texts that were used on the ground, as well as legends, point to a different side, which is the doppelganger, as it were, of this other benevolent side, which is a capricious, tempestuous, and horrific side that can cast curses should a king not continue with his regular propitiation. I use the word propitiation deliberately because forms of her worship were an act of placation or calming down the hot-blooded, fiery nature of the goddess. Rituals that warriors and heroes would perform were fundamentally transactional, I would say, that the hero, the ideal hero, is required to offer a substance that is greatly relished by this goddess, typically blood, from his. I'll go through the ritual practices in a moment, but typically blood, and in return, the goddess is thought to be appeased, and thereby grant sovereignty to the ruler, by which I mean his right to rule, as well as protection over his community, which is to say the entire civic community, the state. So she grants individual rewards that are important for the ruler and the ruler's lineage, but also rewards that would be collectively shared by the state. So rewards, for instance, such as that there would be no drought in the kingdom, or enemies will not attack as frequently. She was offering protection, regal protection, dharmic protection. I use the word Shaktism in the title of the talk to refer to a theological concept called Shakti. Now, although this goddess is called Durgā, there are several aspects to her personality. In her optimal, sort of maximal form, the form that was enhanced through the mechanism of ritual during her grand festival in autumn, which is called the 9 Nights, she was called, or known or understood, as a goddess who not only represented herself, but also other goddesses, many of whom were smaller local divinities that were important to, who would be important to smaller local kingdoms, or a small shrine somewhere in the Himalayas, or a lake in Rajasthan, or anywhere in India. These regionally important deities would, during the festival of the 9 Nights, acquire a unity with Durgā, who would, as Shakti, as this omnipotent, optimal form, represent the classical, the grander, the more heightened aspect of these smaller divinities. Hence, the history of Durgā's cult is not only a history about the development of her mythology and of herself, but also the rise of local divinities connected to the protection of smaller communities who would be assimilated with Durgā. And this process, which is fundamentally a social process, which I'll come to later, can be tracked within sources, epigraphical, literary, scriptural, as well as art historical, within this period that I'm looking at, the 3rd and the 12th centuries AD. So Shakti, to sum up, refers to Durgā in her optimal, cohesive aspect as representative of various other goddesses. Heroic Śāktism is therefore the belief that that a good warrior, good Indic, I use again a word broadly too, because her practice we find also in Southeast Asia, in Java, as well as in Afghanistan. Heroic Śāktism is the belief that a good Indic warrior and hero must necessarily worship Durgā or one of her embodiments for the continued success of their lineage, for the continued health and prosperity of the state, and for the continuation of his right and the right of his lineage to keep holding power. Why is it heroic? An example, the reason why I call it a heroic practice is that that heroic Shaktism is fundamentally linked to warrior culture in India. Certain rituals that were performed during the festival of the goddess during autumn would involve tests that would represent a hero's true ability. Tests, for instance, that ritual literature tells us a good hero having to mutilate himself and offer blood, just little scars, not very. Gosh, I sound dark, don't I? But anyhow, so mutilate himself and offer the blood as a form of self-sacrifice to the goddess. Or we have very extreme, I would say, extreme examples of passionate surrender to the goddess, which we find in iconography as well, of heroes ready to cut their heads off as well, which is something that we keep finding even in Chalukya era iconography as well as throughout literature. So images of nubile heroes lifting their long locks up and with a scimitar, hovering over the neck. Of course, legends say that this never happened. The goddess interceded and said, "Oh, I forgive you and I will help you. O warrior, do not kill yourself." There were practices connected to the goddess that were specifically related to the substantiation of heroism. The book that I'm writing not only contains these practices, but it also contains the stories, the phases that Durgā went through between the 3rd and the 12th centuries AD in successive chapters, that inasmuch as I've been able to glean that process through mythology, literary records, and inscriptional records. Very briefly, I will sum up that developmental process, which is that at the close of during and at the close of the Gupta Empire, so around the 3rd to the 5th centuries AD, as far as can be inferable from sources, and my sources are primarily Sanskrit and Prakrit, Durgā was a Vaishnava goddess, that is to say, a goddess connected with the Indian god, great Indian god Vishnu, great Indian state god Vishnu. She was a goddess of sleep. Sleep and the elements, a goddess called Nidra Kalaratri, who was thought to manifest herself in the skies during the monsoon period in a horrific vision, which in a way resonates with the monsoon sky in India, with thunder and black clouds, a kind of sublime terror, I would say. Gradually, as from the 6th century onwards, we find a parallel process of mythological transformation occurring in sources that are primarily Shaiva or linked to the worship of the god Shiva, which tell us that from the 6th century onwards, this, I would say, largely minor goddess of sleep and the elements is being appropriated within this large-scale popular Indian, grand classical Indian religion of devoted to the god Shiva. And in this process of appropriation into Shaivism, she becomes identified as Shiva's consort, Parvati. Interestingly, not as Parvati herself, but as Parvati's other side, the side that which is not the good consort, but the split other side, a side that Shaiva sources usually would call Chandika or Chandi, the fiery lady. One of the most beautiful examples of this Shaiva Chandika Chandi is a grand 100-verse poem by a Sanskrit poet called Bana, and each of these verses in this sequence celebrates Shiva's consort Parvati careening about in the battlefield, daubed in blood and mire, but returning at the end of the day to Shiva's arms. And there are these strange moments where she actually feels shy when the gods kind of, when they see her defeating the buffalo demon, which legend says one of her chief stories that she defeats this buffalo demon, the gods praise her, and then having accomplished this heroic triumph, she actually blushes and she says, "Oh, I feel so shy." And it's a beautiful, it's a really beautiful. Anyhow, so by the 6th, 7th century we get a Shaiva form. Yes. But the broader, I would say, frame for these internal sectarian movements that are happening in our cult is really a narrative of the state. I've embedded the story of Durgā within a larger narrative of the changing Indian political structure at the close of the Gupta Empire, when empire or imperial coherence centered in an imperial sovereign disintegrates, and we have the rise of local lineages from the 6th century onwards, Chalukyas, Pallavas, etc., upcoming warrior lineages who are coming up and changing the map and worshipping the goddess. And I will leave it at that because perhaps we can go through it in the questions.
Yeah, so rich, multi-dimensional. Thanks a lot for your nice presentation. I am actually wondering naively that on one hand, the goddess is described very much charming, beautiful, loving. There are many different connotations. Even from Indian perspective, the second half is normally soft and weak, so that they even call Abala, that kind of thing. How she can be heroic and how she can be that way not terrific, dangerous. So this is one thing I was wondering. Another thing was you associate the rise of the cult of Durgā with making of the Indian state, Indian kingship. There you cover like from the 3rd century to the 12th century. For the beginning period it's fine. I mean, like you also associate this Vaishnavism, Shaivism, etc. In the early period it's fine, like they are having empire is building, there is a uniting element and so on. But soon, like in the 5th century, 6th century, Indian state starts to disintegrate. But in the sacred side, how this relation is maintained. Like here, Durgā is actually one goddess in many different local goddesses, but now the state is disintegrating. How do you connect these two things?
So maybe I'll start with the second question first, because it develops the last point of the presentation. So at the end of the Gupta Empire, something very interesting happens, which is that local kingdoms, smaller kingdoms, start to develop. Smaller kingdoms, many of them, which certain scholarship has shown, have an aboriginal base. That is, they began in tribes. When they started becoming politically ambitious and coming up on the political map in India, the rulers of these lineages started establishing grand temples to the deities that they traditionally venerated. In the process of this, I would say, elevation or transformation of political structure, the traditional deities of these tribes also acquired, as the kingdom is becoming more complex, and as it is acquiring a more Sanskritic superstructure, I would say the Aboriginal deity acquires a Durgā identity. So now the Aboriginal deity begins to be worshipped in grander temple cults. So her murti, a form, whereas before it would be an iconic form, a stone or a tree. Now this aniconic form acquires a form, the form of Durgā, which is established in the temple. In the process, though, of this transformation from village to kingdom, the original tribal goddess does not lose her tribal identity. It always remains at the heart of the Durgā identity. Sorry, I have to use these terms like Durgā identity and tribal identity. To give a specific example, there is a very important lake in Rajasthan called Shakambara, the Shakambari lake, and a very important divinity of that lake, Shakambari, was propitiated by the ruling lineage of that area, the Chahamanas, as well as the local tribes. They considered Shakambari as the true owner, the true ruler of that particular lake. When the Chahamanas started to expand their territory, they assert in their inscriptions from about 6th, 7th century onwards, they assert in their inscriptions that their right to be lords of the lake of Shakambari was granted by the goddess Shakambari herself. They also, they're basically associating their authority to rule to this goddess. Now, in the 8th century, we find in a very important liturgical text to Durgā called the Devi Mahatmya, this same goddess Shakambari being associated with Durgā in one of the later chapters, which states that Durgā will manifest herself in various local incarnations in various parts of India, one of which is Bhima in the north in Afghanistan, another is as the goddess Shakambari. Now, these are prominent regional divinities which altered or acquired the sovereign face of Durgā as local kingdoms grew and enhanced their power at the close of the Gupta Empire. I hope that answers your question. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
Does anyone have anything they want to ask before I'll give it back to Diwakar?
But I had one more question.
That
was related to
one more. We have to be. I mean, we're going to go all the way up to 2, but I just want to give as much time.
But there was my first question
yes,
about the
yes,
soft and
yes. Right. Yes. So mild and wild.
Yeah.
Mild and wild.
Sublime and terrific.
Yes, sublime and terrific. I think. Right. So it's a difficult question, and I think I will try and first answer it historically, which is that apart from depictions in literature, as well as concepts in religion of, what we would now think of a conventionally feminine role of women, you have an other kind of depiction in mythology and also in religion about divinities, female divinities who are scary. There's these vast, groups of these divinities, such as the yoginis or the matris. Historically, Chandi herself. So divinities which represent the alter ego, the Parvati or the Lakshmi, the softer benevolent goddesses. Some of these female divinities have animal heads as well in some mythologies, such as the old Skanda Purana, which to me shows a kind of almost a physical representation of their otherness, of their animal natures. But perhaps I think it wouldn't be particularly helpful to see Durga as a feminist icon, I think, although much as I would like it to, because ultimately she's not a symbol of the feminine or the female, but she is a symbol of political power.
Exactly.
She is a metaphor of the sovereign power of the state, which is represented in the form of this desirable woman. What does that say? Is that power is
the state power is
is
also ambivalent. No?
Ambivalent as well. That it can protect, but at the same time it can damage. But a death that's always projected as lawful, as dharmic, as expedient, that the state is killing or is asserting its right to punish by killing and protecting its inhabitants from enemies. Yes, so I think she is still very much part of a patriarchal world, but it's unhelpful, I think, if we see her as a prototype of female emancipation. I would like it to be, but
to some extent, maybe we can mention like Prabhavati Gupta. It was
yes,
not
indeed.
that way. I mean, that way really weak, but there were probably
female
one of the early,
donor. Yes. Indeed, yes, you're absolutely right. That there were, as you had actually informed me yesterday, that the early donors of Durga's cult, the rich donors who were making endowments to her shrines and installing icons were powerful women.
But I was mentioning like that. The women folk, they were not that weak.
They had
some of the early in. Which century is Prabhavati Gupta? She was very powerful.
Century, yes.
Powerful.
She was
empress.
the regent, wasn't she? She was
not regent, but she was actually Bakataka queen.
Yes,
she became
indeed.
sovereign.
Yes, indeed. While her son was still young. But I think it's. Of course, one can make a study of whether Durga it shows a different side of the Indian attitude to women. But I think if I think that whether did this cult have any positive impact on, say, creating an ideology in which women had to succeed the throne as embodiments of Durga?
Is not there.
Sadly, no.
So okay, maybe we have to stop. And
maybe have one quick last question, then we'll have to run out. We'd have to be quick, though.
I'm very interested in your emphasis on the identity of Nidra and Durga in the early period. I wonder if you could say where did you go?
Right. Yes. So this forms the first chapter of my book, and if we look at the Harivangsha, which of course you have worked extensively on, there is a large passage on the appearance of this goddess of sleep, who is Vishnu's sleep embodied. She in a nutshell, she is shown to be the god Krishna's twin sister, who takes his place when Kamsa, the murderous Kamsa, is about to come into the night and kill the baby, and then Nidra, Vishnu's sleep, intervenes, again showing the salvific element of the goddess, intervenes in the form of Krishna's sister, takes the place of baby Krishna, so it is she who is killed by the demon. I'm just summarizing the myth very quickly. And as Kangsa is a beautiful description in that myth, as he is lifting the baby, horrible image, as he is lifting her to dash her against the rock, that is when Nidra Kalaratri manifests herself, leaps out from his hands, suddenly grows larger, and goes up into the sky and starts cackling and swigging booze in a little patra, in a little alcohol, in a little liquor in a little cup, and threatens Kangsa that she will drink his blood. His warm blood, if I forget exactly. Yes, it is. But what we find in that description is that there are, and in the chapter I show this, that there are various traces of evidence that show the continuity of Nidra into the later mature conception of Durga. Briefly, the two key, this is something that has been worked on both by Yuko Yokochi in Japan, as well as by the art historian Charlotte Schmidt. And I've added to their evidence body as well. The two critical pieces of evidence in my mind are referring to Nidra as slayers of Shumbha and Nishumbha, the demons that Durga are meant to slay, as the slayer of Mahisha, of course, famous for being Durga's victim, and for being a resident of the Vindhya mountains. Again, a topos that appears in one of the earliest extant Puranic myths about Durga, which is found in the old Skanda Purana legend of Kaushiki. Moreover, I would like to add to Yokochi's argument that there is a long liturgical passage in that myth that is meant to be chanted, which gives a litany of Nidra's names. We find the appearance of exactly the same list of names in other litanies that were chanted to Durga. Essentially, I think to the practitioners of the two traditions, Shaiva and Vaishnava, there was no difference between the two goddesses. The difference lies in when it occurs in history, really. Yes.
We're going to say thank you very much. The book will come out soon. The Game
all
of
the
Thrones
evidence
sequel will be on a mini-series afterwards. And thank you both very much.